The first time he walked into the Maplewood Cafe, it wasn't like a person arriving. It was like a shadow spilling across the floor. It was always 7:15 a.m. on the dot. The bell above the door would give a polite chime, but the air would stiffen as if the wind itself had paused. Conversations hiccuped. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. The ancient ceiling fan, which usually hummed with lazy indifference, seemed to slow its rotation, almost in deference. He didn't shout. He didn't swagger. He didn't need to to the regulars. Mr. Alistair Kane was not just a man. He was a presence, tall and precise. He wore tailored suits even in summer, the deep charcoal kind that made you wonder if they had their own gravitational pull. His silver cufflinks gleamed in the morning light, and his black leather shoes never dared a scuff. He moved with deliberate ease, like every step was measured against a lifetime of control. And when his eyes, a shade of pale steel that felt, both tired and alert, glanced your way, you felt seen, not in the warm, friendly sense. Seen like a ledger sees numbers. For 6 years, Mr. Kane sat at the same corner booth by the window. It wasn't reserved. It didn't have to be. Nobody would dare occupy it. Not even when the cafe overflowed during Saturday breakfast rush. No one really talked to him. Not Margaret, the owner, who had run the cafe for 30 years and could charm grumpy truck drivers into leaving big tips. Not Peter, the young barista who once admitted in a whisper, "He makes me nervous. Like I forgot to pay a debt I never owed." Mr. Kane's order never changed. 1 black coffee, 1 slice of rye toast, 1 poached egg, firm, never runny. And from 7:15 to 8 a.m., he sat in silence, gazing out the window at the main street of Maplewood as if searching for something he'd lost decades ago. The stories about him were plenty. Some said he owned half the town. Some said he was a retired lawyer who had taken down powerful people and made more enemies than friends. Others whispered about a tragedy, a wife who had vanished, a son who hadn't spoken to him in years. But no one really knew, and no one asked. It stayed that way until one Tuesday morning when Emma Blake walked in. Emma was 25, carrying the weight of a city life that hadn't worked out. Chicago had been brutal. Her art dreams crumbled. Her relationship ended, and her bank account had turned into a cruel joke. She came back to Maplewood because rent was cheap. Her grandmother needed help, and maybe, just maybe, she could start over. The Maplewood Cafe was her new job, not her dream. Not even clothes, but it kept the lights on. She'd been there only for days when she noticed something strange. The bell above the door rang, and suddenly everything slowed. That was her first glimpse of Mr. Kane. Margaret quickly whispered, "I'll take that table. Don't you worry about him." It wasn't a suggestion. It was relief. Emma didn't understand. The man just sat there, staring at nothing, his hands resting lightly on the table as though they held invisible weight. He wasn't rude. He wasn't loud. But it was like everyone in the room leaned away from him, not in fear of what he'd do, but of what he was. The days rolled by. Emma worked the morning shift, and Mr. Kane's routine never wavered. Same time, same order, same quiet. But on a Friday, everything changed. The Friday morning began like any other, but Emma sensed something different in the air before she even stepped inside the cafe. The streets felt quieter, the usual chatter of shopkeepers starting their day replaced by a stillness that made her pause for a moment. She pushed open the glass door, and the little bell above it sang its usual greeting, yet it seemed sharper, more deliberate, as though announcing something important. Mr. Kane was already in his corner booth, his profile etched against the pale morning light. He wasn't reading a newspaper or glancing at his watch like he often did. His eyes were fixed on the door, as though he'd been expecting someone. That detail alone caught Emma's attention, the way his gaze didn't drift, the way his hands rested more firmly on the table than usual. Margaret was nowhere to be seen, probably in the back counting the morning's change, and Peter was fumbling with the espresso machine, muttering to himself. For the first time since she'd started working there, no one had stepped in to intercept the inevitable moment. Emma glanced at the order pad in her apron pocket and took a steadying breath. She wasn't afraid of him. Not exactly, but there was an energy about him that pressed against the edges of her thoughts. like standing near the ocean on a stormy day, knowing the waves couldn't reach you, but still feeling the pull. She walked toward his table, the click of her shoes on the wooden floor sounding louder than she expected. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a fraction of a second, she swore there was a flicker, not of coldness, but of recognition. "Good morning," she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. He nodded once. "Coffee, black, rye toast, 1 poached egg." His voice was deep but even, the kind that seemed to have been carved out of stone over many years. "Of course." She wrote it down, though she already knew it by heart. Before she turned away, something made her pause. It was the smallest thing. A slight tremor in his right hand as he reached for the water glass. It wasn't weakness exactly. More like the movement of a man trying to keep something steady that didn't want it to be. When she brought his order, she set the plate down carefully. Instead of retreating immediately like everyone else seemed to, she lingered for just a moment, as if her feet weren't in on the unspoken rules of the cafe. "You're here every morning," she said casually. "That's dedication." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in irritation, but as though weighing whether her comment was harmless or probing. "Routine," he said simply. "It keeps the day from deciding too much for you." She smiled faintly. "Or it keeps you from deciding too much for the day." For the first time, a corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Clever," he murmured. Before Emma could reply, the doorbell chimed again. A man in a worn leather jacket stepped inside. He was younger than Mr. Kane, but carried himself with the same deliberate air, though his was more restless, like a storm cloud that couldn't decide whether to burst. His eyes found Mr. Kane immediately, and something passed between them. Emma saw it. The shift in Kane's posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The newcomer walked straight past the counter, past Peter's tentative greeting, and stopped at the edge of Kane's booth. "Didn't expect to find you here," the man said, his tone somewhere between surprise and challenge. "Then you haven't been looking," Kane replied calmly, without breaking his gaze. Emma felt the air grow heavier again. But this time it was different, not the quiet awe that followed Kane's usual rival, but a tension that curled itself into every corner of the room. Customers at nearby tables pretended to be absorbed in their plates, though their eyes flickered between the two men. The man in the jacket glanced at Emma, his expression softening slightly. "You're new here," he said, almost as if it mattered. "I am," she replied, uncertain of what role she was suddenly playing in whatever this was. He gave a small nod, then turned back to Kane. "Still keeping your secrets?" Kane's reply came without hesitation. "Some things are better kept than misunderstood." The man studied him for a long moment, then slid into the opposite side of the booth without asking. Emma couldn't help but notice that Kane didn't move to stop him. She brought another cup of coffee without being asked, setting it between them. Neither man thanked her, but both watched her in a way that made her feel, oddly, not unwelcome, just involved. As she stepped away, she heard the man in the jacket say quietly, "They deserve to know. Alistair, you can't carry it alone forever." And though she didn't understand the words, Emma knew she'd just stepped into something far larger than a cafe shift, something that had been waiting, quietly, for the right moment to surface. She just didn't know yet that she might be the one to bring it into the light. The next morning the cafe felt different, though Emma couldn't explain why. The light through the front windows seemed softer, but the air was thicker somehow, as if the conversations and clinking dishes were all happening under a blanket. She had barely tied her apron when she noticed that Mr. Kane's usual booth was empty. It was 7:18. He had never been late before. She kept glancing at the door between taking orders and refilling coffee cups. Every time the bell above the door rang, she half expected to see him step through. The quiet figure in the charcoal suit, but it was only regular customers and a few unfamiliar faces. Her mind kept circling back to the stranger from yesterday, the man in the leather jacket, and the way he'd spoken to Kane. They deserved to know. The words stuck like a note left in her pocket. At 7:37, the bell finally chimed. Mr. Kane stepped inside, but something was different about him. The meticulous polish of his shoes was dulled by a faint dusting of dirt. as though he'd walked farther than usual that morning. His tie was slightly off-center, and there was a trace of tiredness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Emma caught his gaze as he entered. For the briefest moment, it was as if he looked through the crowd and saw only her. She moved toward his table with the notepad in hand, but before she could speak, he said quietly, "Just coffee this morning. Not hungry?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Not for food," he replied, settling into the booth. There was no irritation in his voice. If anything, it sounded almost grateful that she had asked. As she poured his coffee, she noticed his hand hover over the rim of the cup for a second. Too long, like he was steadying himself before taking it. The tremor was there again. More noticeable now, the doorbell rang. Emma glanced up and felt her stomach tighten. The man in the leather jacket had returned, this time without the restless storm in his eyes. His gaze was steady, purposeful. He walked straight to Kane's booth, but didn't sit down right away. "You didn't come last night," the man said quietly. "I had nothing to say," Kane replied, lifting his cup to his lips. "You've had nothing to say for years," the man countered. There was no malice in his voice, just a quiet frustration that sounded worn, like it had been carried for too long. Emma stood frozen a few feet away, torn between stepping back and pretending she hadn't heard, or staying and listening to the thread of a story she didn't yet understand. Something in the man's voice made her stay. The stranger finally slid into the booth across from Kane. "You think silence protects people. It doesn't. It only keeps them from knowing the truth they deserve." Kane set his cup down carefully. "Truth is a fragile thing in the wrong hands. And in the right hands?" the man asked. Kane's eyes flickered, just once, toward Emma. It was a glance so quick she might have imagined it, but it landed in her chest like a stone in water. The man in the jacket leaned forward. "She's already part of it. You can see that. You can feel it." Emma felt her heart pick up speed. She had no idea what it was, but she could feel the weight of it pressing around them. The cafe door opened again. A woman in a pale blue coat stepped inside, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Kane. She froze in place, the air between them changing as though some old, unseen thread had been pulled taut. Kane's face didn't move, but something in his stillness deepened. Emma didn't know who the woman was, or why Kane suddenly seemed to be holding back a tide that wanted to break. She only knew that whatever was unfolding wasn't a passing encounter. It was something that had been waiting in the shadows for years, and she was standing right in the middle of it. And though she couldn't have explained why, Emma knew that before this was over, she would have to choose to look away like everyone else had, or to step closer and risk everything to hear the truth. The woman in the pale blue coat didn't move at first. She just stood there in the doorway, her gloved hands clutching a small leather satchel, her eyes fixed on Kane as though she had spent years rehearsing for this exact moment. The cafe seemed to shrink around her presence, the clinking of cutlery dulled, conversations thinned to whispers. Even the steam curling from the coffee machine seemed to pause midair. Kane didn't rise to greet her. He didn't even shift in his seat, but his gaze was locked on her, unblinking, as if the sight of her had frozen something deep inside him. The man in the leather jacket leaned back slightly, his expression a mix of surprise and relief, like a chess player who had just seen a game take an unexpected turn. Emma, caught between two tables with an empty coffee pot in her hand, felt her pulse quicken. She didn't know this woman, but there was something in the way she and Kane were looking at each other, not anger, not joy, but a kind of heavy recognition that made it impossible to look away. The woman finally stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly against the worn wooden floor, each step deliberate. She stopped at the edge of Kane's booth. "It's been a long time," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the kind of calm that comes after a storm, not before one. "Time hasn't changed you," Kane replied, though his voice was quieter than usual, almost cautious. "Time changes everything," she said, setting her satchel down on the table. "You just didn't let it show." The man in the leather jacket glanced at Emma briefly, as if checking to see whether she was paying attention, and she was. Every word, every pause, felt like a clue to something that had been buried deep for too long. The woman's eyes softened, but there was something sharper underneath. You think you've been protecting people by staying silent, but silence doesn't erase what happened. It only hides it. Kane's gaze flickered for the first time, not toward the woman, but toward Emma. It was the same fleeting glance as before, but this time Emma knew she hadn't imagined it. She felt it, a wordless connection, as though her presence was no longer an accident. The woman in blue opened her satchel slowly, her gloved fingers careful with whatever was inside. From it, she drew a worn envelope, its edges frayed and yellowed. She placed it gently in front of Kane. "You kept this," she said, "all these years." Kane didn't touch the envelope. He looked at it for a long moment, then said, "Some things you don't throw away, no matter how much they weigh." The man in the leather jacket leaned forward, his voice low. "This is your chance. Tell her, tell all of us." The cafe felt impossibly still. Emma realized she was holding her breath. She didn't know what was in that envelope, but she knew without a doubt that it held the thread that connected every strange glance, every unspoken word, every hush that seemed to follow Kane. Kane finally spoke, his voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. "The truth isn't just about what happened," he said. "It's about why it happened. And sometimes, that's the part people can't forgive." The woman's eyes didn't leave his. "Then let them decide. They can't forgive what they don't know." For a moment, no one moved. Then Kane's hand, the same hand that had trembled over a coffee cup just yesterday, reached toward the envelope. His fingers rested on it, but he didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he looked at Emma again, his pale steel eyes searching hers. "If I open this," he said quietly, "there's no going back. Not for me, not for you. Are you ready for that?" Emma felt the weight of the question. Even though she didn't understand all of it, the part of her that craved safety wanted to step back. But another part, the one that had kept her in the cafe yesterday when she could have walked away, made her answer without hesitation. "Yes," she said. Kane held her gaze for a beat longer, then nodded once. His fingers slid under the envelope's flap, and the sound of paper tearing through the still air felt louder than any bell or voice. Whatever was inside, Emma knew it would change everything. The paper inside the envelope was thin, the kind that had been folded and unfolded so many times it threatened to tear along the creases. Kane didn't rush. He smoothed it out on the table with careful hands, his eyes moving over the words before anyone else could see them. Emma leaned forward, slightly, her heart drumming in her ears. The man in the leather jacket sat perfectly still, watching Kane's face more than the paper. The woman in the pale blue coat clasped her hands together on the table, her knuckles pale under the gloves. When Kane finally spoke, his voice had changed. It wasn't the calm, controlled tone the cafe had always known. It was lower, heavier, as if each word cost him something to give. "This," he said, tapping the paper lightly, "is the day everything stopped. For me, for them, for this town." No one interrupted. The whole room seemed to lean in, though most of the customers were pretending not to listen. "It was 22 years ago," Kane continued, his gaze fixed on some point far beyond the cafe's walls. "There was a fire at the South Warehouse. Most people think it was an accident. It wasn't. It was meant to cover something else." Emma felt a chill rise up her spine. She hadn't expected this to begin with something so stark. "I was there," Kane went on. "Not as an owner, not as a bystander. I was the one who locked the doors that night." The words landed in the air like stones dropped into still water. Emma saw the man in the leather jacket tense, but he didn't speak. "I thought I was protecting someone," Kane said. "I thought I was keeping them safe. But people were hurt, badly hurt, and one didn't make it." The woman in the blue coat's eyes glistened, though she didn't let a tear fall. "You're still protecting them, aren't you?" she said quietly. Kane didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, almost absently. "If I give you the rest of this, the names, the reason, it won't just be my life that changes. It will touch everyone who's been trying to forget." Emma realized her hands had tightened around the handle of the empty coffee pot. She was still holding. She set it down gently, afraid of breaking the fragile silence. "You've carried it long enough," the man in the jacket said. "Let it out. Let them see who you really are." Kane looked at Emma again. And if who I really am is the reason someone lost everything, she didn't flinch, then at least it's the truth. People can decide what to do with the truth. They can't do anything with silence. Something in his expression shifted then, not relief, but the faintest easing of the weight in his eyes. He turned the paper so it faced the others, revealing a list of names, dates, and a single short letter written in rushed, uneven handwriting. The woman's breath caught when she saw it. Her gloved hand reached out, trembling slightly, but she stopped short of touching the page. "You kept this," she whispered, almost to herself. "I kept it," Kane said, "because one day I knew I'd have to answer for it." Emma didn't know the details yet, the connections between the names, the meaning of the letter, but she could feel it. This wasn't just a confession. This was the first crack in a wall that had stood for more than 2 decades. The cafe door opened again, and this time, the man who entered wasn't a stranger. The entire room seemed to recognize him. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs shifted. He was younger than Kane, but there was a resemblance in the set of his jaw, in the way he scanned the room like someone who had learned to read people before they spoke. He walked straight to the booth, his eyes locked on Kane. "I heard. You're talking," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. Kane didn't look away. "I am." The newcomer's gaze slid to the paper on the table, then back to Kane. "Then I guess it's time I told my part of it to Emma." Didn't know why, but she felt certain the next thing said would shatter whatever fragile balance was left. And yet, every part of her wanted to hear it. The young man didn't sit right away. He stood at the end of the booth, his presence filling the space like a sudden change in weather. His eyes, a sharper shade of the same steel gray as Kane's, lingered on the paper between them. Emma could feel it now, the thread connecting them all. The man in the jacket, the woman in the blue coat, Kane, and this newcomer. Whatever story was about to unfold, it was theirs, and somehow, she had been pulled into its center. Finally, the young man slid into the booth across from Kane, beside the man in the jacket. He didn't glance at Emma, didn't even acknowledge the quiet audience of the cafe, but his voice carried easily across the room. "You told yourself you were protecting me," he said, his tone controlled but laced with something raw. "That's why you locked those doors. That's why you took the blame, but it wasn't your fault." Kane's jaw tightened, though his eyes didn't waver. "It doesn't matter whose fault it was. I was there. I could have stopped it." The woman in the blue coat finally spoke, her voice softer now. "And you've carried that weight for both of them ever since." The young man shook his head. "And in the process, you carried it away from the people who needed to face it." He reached for the paper, his fingers brushing the corner, but he didn't pull it closer. "You should have let me speak back then." "I couldn't," Kane said. "You were too young. You didn't know how the world would use it against you." Emma's heart clenched at the words. There was love in them, but also regret, the kind that had been sharpened by years of silence. The young man leaned forward. "I know now, and I'm telling you, I'm ready to speak, but not without you." The cafe was silent. Even the old clock above the counter seemed to have stopped ticking. Kane's gaze dropped to the paper again, and when he spoke, it was as if he were speaking to the whole room. "The fire wasn't an accident," he began. "It was set to destroy records that would have revealed where the money was going. Money stolen from the people who worked in that warehouse, money taken from their families." Gasps rippled quietly through the cafe, though no one dared speak. Kane continued, his voice steady. "I found out that night. I went there to stop it, but when I arrived, the flames had already started. I locked the doors to keep the wrong people from getting in and taking what they came for. But I didn't realize someone else was still inside." Emma's chest tightened. She could almost see it, the flicker of firelight, the panic of the moment, the terrible weight of knowing one decision had changed everything. The young man's voice softened. "That someone was my best friend, and I was supposed to meet him there that night. If I had been on time." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The woman in the blue coat reached for Kane's hand across the table. "We can't change it," she said, "but we can tell the truth now." Kane looked at Emma again, and in that moment, she understood why he kept looking to her. She wasn't tied to the past like the rest of them. She was the one who could carry the story forward, without the weight of old wounds distorting it. "Will you tell it?" Kane asked her quietly. Emma felt the question settle deep inside her. She thought of all the mornings she'd seen him coming, the quiet that followed him, the stories whispered but never confirmed. She thought of how many people in the room were leaning forward now, waiting. "Yes," she said, "I'll tell it all." Kane's shoulders lowered slightly, the faintest release of tension, as if he'd been holding his breath for decades. The young man nodded. The woman in the blue coat smiled faintly, her eyes wet but calm. Outside, the first sunlight of the day broke through the clouds, spilling across the street and through the cafe windows. It caught the paper on the table, turning its worn edges. Gold. Emma knew it wouldn't be easy. Telling the story would stir things people might wish had stayed buried, but it would also free others, and maybe, just maybe, free Kane himself. And as she picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands, she realized something. Courage didn't always roar into a room. Sometimes it walked in quietly, sat in the same booth every morning, and waited for the right moment to be heard.